Good morning, everybody. I'm Aaron Wiltshire, Director of Events here at ETOA. I just wanted to take a few moments at the beginning of this webinar to welcome everybody. If I haven't seen you yet this year, Happy New Year. I'll be handing over to Rachel shortly, but just as everybody arrives, because we're still on the hour, I just wanted to kind of highlight that this is brought to you as part of the Hoteliers European Marketplace, which is a forthcoming hotel B2B matchmaking workshop for hotel properties and people selling rooms from across Europe to intra and into European tour operators from long-haul markets and the intra-European market. This year, obviously delivered online, therefore quite a big opportunity to reach long-haul markets that maybe you haven't been in touch with. So I would draw your attention to etoa.org/hem, where you'll find the information for that event. Marta is with us today, and with her, if you're part of one of the associate members of the HOTREC community, then there is a special deal available that brings it down to the member rate of €449 to attend a full day event on that, bringing in at around €15 per meeting. So even without all the travel costs, etc., that's a really good opportunity to lay the foundations for business this year and then into the future, of which you'll hear a lot more about in the next 45 minutes or so. So I think that's it from me. I'll draw your attention to the question field. If you have anything that you'd like to ask any of our speakers, I think we'll do that one by one as we go through. Please drop those in and Rachel will help field them for you. I look forward to seeing you all soon. I'll hand over to Rachel now. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Welcome everybody to this webinar on hotels, accommodation providers and the travel trade in 2021 to 2022. My name is Rachel Reid. I am the Director of Insight here at ETOA, and with us this morning we have got David Edwards, who is our resident tourism insight expert, so welcome David. And we also have Marta Machado, the Deputy Director General of our partners HOTREC over in Brussels. So welcome to both of you. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you both very shortly. Just before we start with David, who's going to give us the latest picture for the travel industry and for the hotel sector in terms of bookings and how and when we might see a recovery and what factors might need to be in place. I will just mention that many of the stats and charts that David is going to reference are available on our Insight Hub. So if you haven't seen the Insight Hub, do go to our website, etoa.org/insight, or you can see it from the main tab. And in there you will find lots and lots of research and insight pieces. You can look them up by category. So if you want to specifically look for accommodation, there is an accommodation sector and various other ones as well, so you can see on there. Just something to note is that a lot of it is member-only access because it is primarily a member service, so you do need your website login details if it's got the member banner across the top of that. But as I say, almost everything that David is referencing is available on the hub if you want to go and look for it later for the full details of the reports. So without further ado, we will begin with David. And as Aaron mentioned, David is going to speak for about 10-15 minutes, and you can of course ask questions at any time via the question facility. We'll then cover off a couple of questions specific to David, and then we'll move on to Marta and do the same, and we can have a general Q&A at the end of the session. So David, I will hand over to you, and we look forward to hearing your stats and information.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel, and good morning to everyone. So I will now begin the presentation. Hopefully you can all see my screen with the leader slide. And so we're going to be talking about opportunities and obstacles for the hotel sector in 2021, and I'm going to be particularly focusing on the demand side. So what will we be covering? We'll have a look at what happened back in 2020, then think about what we know regarding current consumer sentiment, talk about what I term the fog of uncertainty, so the difficulty of trying to make predictions where we are today, think about how there may be quite a long-term impact of the pandemic on cities, which of course is where many international visitors to destinations in Europe will previously have been staying, and then present a perspective on what prospects might be for the upcoming year. So let's begin that journey with a global view. And now the United Nations World Tourism Organization has forecast that last year there will have been a 70% decline in international tourist arrivals. The UNWTO regularly consults with what it terms its panel of experts, and that panel of experts does expect there to be some degree of rebound in 2021. But the consensus is that that rebound is unlikely to really get into gear until Q3 of this year. And in line with a number of other organisations, it is reckoned that 2023 is when the volumes that we witnessed back in 2019 are next likely to materialise. Now, clearly the main driver of this reduction in travel is the pandemic itself, but the panel of experts has also identified that the key obstacle to recovery are the fact that, yes, there are all of these protocols and restrictions at present, but there is very little in the way of consistency in how those processes and restrictions are being applied. So UNWTO is in effect the umbrella organisation for governments around the world thinking about travel and tourism. World Travel and Tourism Council is the umbrella organisation for the larger corporates. And last summer, they did an awful lot of modelling work in terms of what the impacts may be. And unfortunately, it does look as though we're on track for what they termed their worst case scenario. This would see globally around about 198 million fewer travel and tourism jobs, a $5,543 billion loss in travel and tourism GDP, with international arrivals declining 73% and domestic arrivals by slightly less, but still a hefty 64%. Thinking about the aviation sector, well, IATA expect that passenger traffic was down at 61% in 2020, with revenues falling somewhat further by 66% due to international travel falling by more than domestic. Looking ahead to 2021, IATA are expecting some degree of improvement on last year, but are sanguine about the fact that revenue likely to remain 45% lower than where it was in 2019. And whilst airlines and many others across the travel and tourism sector have been calling for restrictions to be removed as soon as is practicable, IATA does expect that we will see many travel restrictions in place for the first half of 2021. And that results in many airlines facing a really acute financial situation, with the likely loss of up to 4.8 million aviation jobs across the world. And indeed, just this very day, we have seen Norwegian say that they are going to completely abandon the idea of flying long haul and just sticking with their short haul flights within Europe. And that in its own right sees around about 1,000 job losses at their Gatwick base here in the UK. Now, one of the documents that you will find on the Insight Hub is the regular quarterly report put together by the European Travel Commission, and they worked with Tourism Economics to do a range of modelling work. We see here the gradual increase in international arrivals in Europe over the 15 or so years through to 2019, then the now very familiar plunge in travel last year, and then they have the baseline, optimistic and pessimistic scenario forward, all of which see travel not recovering to pre-pandemic levels until at least 2023, and with their more pessimistic outcome being somewhat after that. Also in that same report, there is analysis based on work that STR have conducted. I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with their benchmarking data. This chart looks at different regions of Europe, presenting data for the first 3 quarters of last year. We can see that across all regions of Europe, hotel occupancy down by 50+%. Room rates, they did fall, and we all know that it's very difficult after room rates have been reduced to increase them. So it's not surprising that room rates only fell by about 10 to 15%, but bringing together that decline in room rate and occupancy, we of course see revenue per available room declining by 60 or so %. Now, the late summer, early autumn of last year was in a sense the high watermark. During November and December, we did start to see further declines as many imposed lockdowns due to the second wave. Now, more recent analysis from Expedia is really, really insightful. And what this chart does is look at why people around the globe have been moving to Expedia websites. And what we can see is that the most common reason is to dream rather than to shop. But there's a couple of good points we can draw from this chart. One is that clearly people are still dreaming about travel. They have not lost that emotional connection with wanting to think about the joy of travel and tourism. And we can see that certainly during the summer months of last year, people were indeed shopping. And we are hearing now that there are some good prospects for booking picking up towards the second, third quarter of this year. But what the Expedia analysis also reveals is that those who are shopping are very much shopping for travel in the immediate future. So we can see here a real growth in the early months of the pandemic in 0 to 21 day time horizons that people were interested in. That I certainly anticipate is going to be with us for some months yet to come. We may in time revert to a more traditional booking window, but at the moment people are really saying, I've got an opportunity to travel, restrictions, I know what they are today, so I'm going to travel tomorrow rather than in 3-6 months time. Expedia also talked to around about 1,000 consumers in each of 11 countries worldwide and quizzed them as terms of, well, what would really build your confidence for booking and taking trips over the next 12 months? And the lead insight, frankly, is this 7 in 10 saying, well, to feel confident in booking, what I need is a guarantee of flexibility to really be sure that if something goes wrong, I get all of my money back, and so do not lose out financially. So on to the fog of uncertainty. Now, forecasts always rely on making assumptions, but in normal times, there are certain parameters that you can be fairly sure of. However, these, as you know, are not normal times. So it may well be the case that a better term would be guess casting when we're trying to look ahead to the rest of this year. Now, the arrival of effective vaccines in the last 2 or so months certainly is a great leap forward. It clears up a little bit of that uncertainty. But as I've said in this box, we need to be really cautious about what I've termed optimism bias. So yes, there are no effective vaccines, but we have to be realistic about the timescale in which those will be rolled out and the fact that there is a lag between people being vaccinated and becoming immune. Another concern looking ahead for this year is one to do with paperwork, if you like, and the fact that international travel has become more complex and many of the restrictions may be in place for slightly longer than we would like them to be. Plus, there is the added risk that those who have been vaccinated may start to become somewhat frustrated if they are told that to visit a certain destination or indeed to return to their home country, they still need to pay for and organise PCR tests. Now, there are a number of common themes that have emerged when different very august bodies have been thinking about what we're likely to see. Those common themes include that it will be 3 or 4 years before tourism is back to where it was in 2019, that domestic travel is likely to recover more quickly than international, that leisure travel will recover more quickly than business and events related travel, that FIT will recover much more quickly than group tours, and that we will see increased interest in rural destinations, in activities and experience. Now, all of that may well prove to be true, but we do have to be wary of herd mentality. So all of these projections, these prophecies seem entirely reasonable given what we know, but there is a risk that because they seem reasonable, more and more people align themselves with saying this is what's going to happen. Now, thinking about cities and what I've termed here long COVID for cities, I am not for one moment foretelling the end of people going to offices to work, but it is realistic to believe that we will see a permanent shift towards more people working at home for at least some of the working week. That in turn means that cities will be hosting fewer commuters. In turn, very hard-pressed businesses will be thinking, we can get away with somewhat less office space than we currently have, which in turn frees up or provides an opportunity to repurpose some of that real estate for other uses, be that housing or leisure. But it does, of course, pose a real challenge for many hospitality businesses based in city centres who rely perhaps primarily for their trade on commuters rather than visitors. So what it may well in turn do is encourage city authorities and decision makers to really understand just how important visitors to their cities will be going forward. Some of you may have heard me talk about the 3 M's over the past number of months, what I term the essential ingredients for recovery in consumer demand, those being motivation to visit, money to spend, and a means of travel. In terms of motivation to visit, I think we can be reasonably optimistic. All of the evidence suggests that people remain really with a strong appetite to travel as soon as it is again safe and practical to do so. However, some behaviours may have changed, at least in the short term. Perhaps more of a concern is the second M, so money to spend. Certainly thus far, it has been younger generations who've been financially harder hit than older generations, and it is likely to be well into this year before we really get to understand what the full economic fallout from the pandemic has been. In terms of means of travel, well, certainly there has been a dramatic reduction in the supply of international carriers provision, be that air, sea or rail. And it is very likely that throughout this year, capacity will remain constrained. But if demand does start to pick up during this year, what we may well see is fares start to pick up, partly because carriers are desperate to try and generate revenue, but also because we will see slightly less competition than there was pre-pandemic. And a bonus M, so a 4th M, what I've termed here memories. There is potentially a risk that there will have been permanent scarring to the supply side. So cities in particular may have fewer bars, fewer theatres, fewer hotels, fewer restaurants, fewer visitor attractions, all of which of course then erodes the visitor experience. So let's think about the year ahead, and I know it's normal to think about quarters of a year, but rather than doing that, I'm thinking about 2021 in terms of thirds of the year. January to April, so the first third, pretty much there is little to no prospect of international travel in any meaningful sense. So not quite a complete write-off, but by and large, over the coming 4 months, I do not see any realistic prospect of travel internationally. Then the middle 3 months of the year, a really interesting period. I'm reckoning we may well see demand pick up somewhat more quickly than many have said, but what I'm also reckoning is that that pickup may flash to deceive, as it may well be as much a reflection of people making good on future travel vouchers that they accepted for postponed 2020 travel, and people undertaking that pent-up VFR demand from last year. Then the final third of the year is when it gets really interesting. So September through to December, that will be the real litmus test as to how much impact the economic fallout from the pandemic will have had on consumer confidence, and will probably be the best bellwether as to what we can expect in 2022 and indeed beyond. So that is where I will end my presentation. So I will make Rachel a presenter.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. All very interesting things there. As I mentioned at the beginning, do please type any questions you have for our panelists into the question section. And just before we move on to hear from Marta and the policy perspective, David, there's a couple of things that have come in regarding some of the things you mentioned. Obviously, one of them was the sort of slower or long-term drop in business travel. And obviously, I know you also mentioned it being somewhat guess casting as opposed to forecasting. But there is a question around, is there any data on the potential impact for hotels on a longer term drop in business travel? Does anyone provide that?
There is a lot of supposition rather than data, because in a sense, business travel has always operated with a really short lead time in comparison to leisure travel. Therefore, it's very difficult to read the runes, if you like, in terms of, well, what will we be expecting in terms of booking levels and what have we actually got. Now, there will be international business travel in the future. However, I think it is entirely reasonable to suppose that for the foreseeable future, there will be less business travel, in part because of what is termed the paradox of thrift. So those businesses that have survived the pandemic will be really thinking, how can we limit the amount of outgoings that we have as a business? And one of the lines on the cost sheet that will be looked at is travel. And in a sense, that is one of the easier lines to say, do you know what? We can probably get away with rather less of that. And the last 9 months has proven that many businesses can survive with their staff doing Zoom meetings rather than getting on an aeroplane. Plus, of course, we have the ongoing environmental pressure on businesses to rein in some of the travel that may be taking place. So I think a downward step change in the volume of business travel is pretty much baked in, to use a phrase we often hear these days. But that doesn't mean to say there will be no business travel going forward. There absolutely will, but probably at a lower level than we saw in 2019 and before.
Thank you. And then one last thing before we move on is we have discussed this seeing an increase in domestic and near neighbours travel as opposed to long haul. Surely this is a piece of good news for hotels because it's still somebody in the bed, isn't it? Is that a sort of sensible way of looking at it?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at tourism at a global level, most of it was domestic, even pre-pandemic. But the sorts of destinations that domestic travel would involve were often very different to the sorts of destinations within a country that would primarily rely on international travel. So take the likes of Paris or London or New York. Yes, each of those does receive domestic travel, but they are much more reliant upon international. So it may well be that some hotels benefit from this shift to domestic, or pivot to domestic as it's sometimes been termed, but they may well be hotels that are in more provincial, rural, coastal types of destinations rather than the main metropolis types of destinations, in part because people may still be thinking, do you know what, I'm going to go somewhere, in quotes, quieter, less busy than city centres. Even though, of course, ironically, city centres are almost deserted at the moment. So in one sense, it's the best time to experience some of our larger cities. So yes, some hotels may benefit from a pivot to domestic, but I think there are others who will have to work really hard to try and encourage domestic travellers to go to the sorts of places that perhaps have previously been the preserve of international visitors.
Indeed. Thank you very much, David. We're going to now move on to Marta from HOTREC, who is going to give us the policy perspective. She's going to talk about the latest efforts to reassure client safety and what sort of support might be available for hotels at EU and national levels. So over to you, Marta.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you very much, first of all, for this opportunity to join you all in this webinar. Really a pleasure, especially during these difficult circumstances, and really willing to share with you some of the positive messages that we hope we are passing to the EU institutions in order to help really the business to be rebuilt, because this is what we need right now, really to rebuild the hospitality sector. I'm just going to share my screen now so that I can share with you the slides. Hopefully you will be able to see them. So first of all, for those of you who are not so familiar with, so HOTREC is the European Association of Hotels, Restaurants and Cafés in Europe. We now gather 44 national associations, not only from the EU, but also from other countries in Europe, namely Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, amongst others. And this might be of interest to you. We only represent national associations. We don't actually have companies as members. So companies are only the members of our members who are the national associations. And our role here in Brussels is really to pass the main messages in terms of policy to the EU institutions. The reason why we usually say that we are the voice of the hospitality sector in Europe. Now, I think David already explained very well the situation so far for the hospitality businesses. We are really facing an unprecedented challenge, facing since March last year already. This is possibly called the third wave, and where companies really report between 80 to 90% loss of turnover when it's not 100%. For instance, we also represent the late night entertainment and discotheques. You know, they are mostly in most countries closed since March last year. So the problems, you all know what they all were. In the first wave, there was also a lack of confidence, trust, even though, as David pointed out very well, we have statistics also coming from Expedia saying that especially after summer, if there was the possibility of enjoy a bar, restaurant, and hotel, and if they were open, then clients were actually willing to enjoy it. During the first wave, also terribly when terrible circumstance when borders were closed and there were absolutely no flights. At least during the second and now third wave, we see that for the most of the countries have not closed their borders, and this in terms of employment, of course, has a huge impact. The Commission had before summer last year foreseen possible loss of 6 million jobs. Well, according to at least some statistics of Eurostat, in the last quarter of 2020, on the Q3 compared to 2019, we had a drop of 15.5% of jobs. But we see it as well in a positive way, and we count with several solutions, namely the EU and national funding, harmonization of border restrictions in the EU, health and safety we see as a priority, a coordinated approach when it comes to vaccine, and for businesses, we think it's important to rethink strategies and develop new plans. So what about the EU and national funding? So when it comes to this, you know that state aid is really has been the fundamental tool so far, and now it has been extended until the end of June 2021. So here we are talking about funding coming from member states, basically. The only thing is that they need to be deployed, and the procedure needs to be provided the okay by the European Commission. Now then, very important type of funding that companies should be looking at is the cohesion funds. And here we have the Corona Response Investment Initiative, which now led into the REACT EU. Why do I say it's fundamental? Because you as companies are really supposed to contact your managing authorities and ask what type of help can they provide. And we have seen that in several member states, there were companies asking for it, and they had access to different types of funding, namely to cover for the labor costs, for the rents, for materials to comply with health and safety protocols, and also to help on skills, which is now really a very important priority for us. Under the REACT EU, you will also find a lot of money for the short-term employment schemes. Then we have the SURE mechanism, which for some countries was really fundamental during last year to again provide and cover for employment covers. And we have, of course, the recovery plans where all our hopes are lying. When it comes to state aid, well, here we have some examples of measures that have been taken by countries. I suppose that more or less all of them have put forward measures. Of course, here we know that there are some member states who have more money than others, and therefore more possibilities of helping companies than others. But here, what we are asking the EU institutions is really to have the aid as prolonged as much as possible, and until when it is needed, possibly until, for instance, the money from the recovery plans is received. And here, some good examples are, for instance, the rental relief, the compensation of lost turnover, the wage subsidies, and the tax relief. What we don't see with very good eyes, not anymore at least, are the loans, because the companies now really reach the level of debt that they cannot cope anymore, and therefore what we ask for are direct grants. Here it is just a slide. You can read it more carefully later on with some good examples, again, provided by our members of state aid provided at national level. For instance, we see Denmark with some compensation between 75 to 100% of the usual salary paid by government. And this was really one of our fundamental lobbying campaigns towards the institutions, was decreasing VAT. Some of member states really decreased as much as possible. We would really consider that this is a measure that really boosts the economy and provides and helps to have more jobs. But for this, of course, we need companies to be open, otherwise there are no transactions. Now, as I mentioned before, where do all our hopes rely on? These are on the recovery plans. So as you probably know, every member state is now in the procedure of proposing the European Commission their recovery plans for the years to come. And here what we advised our members, and we really had huge talks and working groups with them, was for them to influence their own member states in really putting forward the measures in the recovery plans that would help the business in the recovery. This in the long term, so focusing on environmental measures, on digital measures, but as well on skills. And if we take a look at the Commission project. What they are looking at is these measures that are on the slide. So renovate, for instance, using energy efficiency for private buildings, power up using the clean technologies, reskill and upskill, also connect everything related with digital, extending the broadband services, scale up, so using these industrial data cloud, and recharge and refuel, so using of clean technologies, accessible transports, etc. So this could be eventually useful for you because these are the activities that we have considered very important in terms of these ones are sustainability, then we have also some others on digital and others on skills. So we think that it would be fundamental to put in the recovery plans the renewal of buildings, so to lower the level of carbon footprint, for instance, of hotels, to make them more energy efficient, for them to know how to use their water resources, to have proper ventilation of the establishments. Many times we hear that hotels do not have the capacity to put in place real good fire safety infrastructure. So here it is the opportunity to do so. Have efficient cooling, heating systems, clean technologies, make the business accessible for those who have special needs, know how to invest in waste, in prevention and management, etc. When it comes to digital, we really think it is fundamental to support SME digitalization, that all businesses have Wi-Fi, that there are development of apps, for instance, contactless menus, check-in, check-out, done in an automatic way, apps to provide personalized service to consumers. And of course, a very important point that, for instance, platforms actually share the data they have on their clients with all the businesses. And the main goal is really for the businesses to know better their clients and customers, and to customize the better way possible their own offers. When it comes to skills, we now, I mean, if already before the crisis, one of our fundamental goals was to really attract and retain the workforce in our establishments, because we have really a problem with skills, and you more than anyone can actually say that. So we think that it would be really important for the member states to include in their recovery plans lots of programs regarding skills, namely the development of apprenticeship schemes at national level, but also the development of digital skills. For instance, how to use and manage a CMS system in an hotel, how to use, and very important, how to access aggregate data, the one possibly provided by the platforms, how to use different apps, and also how to behave in a more environmentally friendly manner. For instance, do you know, and do the employees in your hotels and establishments know how to efficiently use water and energy? How can they reduce food waste? This is for us very important. The Commission is really putting a lot of pressure on us on this, and especially with the targets on food waste upcoming in 2023, how to cooperate on food donations. Then interpersonal skills, of course, if you are in the tourism sector, is fundamental, and knowing different languages as well. Then also part of our plan is the harmonizing of border restrictions in the EU. And here, really, I can tell that NET, which is the network of the European private sector in tourism, where actually ETOA and also HOTREC are members, have been really vocal since the beginning of the crisis in coming up with common positions, press releases, etc., and really trying to call on member states to come with an harmonized approach. And we already have things there. We have the Council recommendation, which was issued on the 13th of October last year, where actually member states were saying that whenever there are restrictions to the free movement of people, there needs to be a coordinated approach. Well, when we look back to what happened during this Christmas period, we put our hands in the head and say, how is this possible? There was absolutely no coordination and no information to the travelers on what could they expect when they were traveling. And there is also already in place the European Commission recommendations together with ECDC, so the European Centre for Disease Control, and the EASA, so the European Aviation Safety Agency recommendations, which said that overall they were against systematic testing and quarantine, and for short periods of travel of 72 hours, people should be exempted of being PCR tested and in quarantine. But then we again take a look of what happened during these Christmas holidays and still going on during this period, and we see that there was no coordination at all. So what do we as NET ask to the EU institutions? We really want a robust coordination of member states when it comes to border restrictions. We want clear information provided to travelers in advance, massive test capacity at airports, bus terminals, train stations, rapid test methods put in place, so the antigen tests. Mutual recognition of test results is really very important. When it comes to health and safety, I'm sure you all aware of this. We think it is absolutely fundamental that all the companies follow strictly, really strictly, all the health and safety protocols put in place at national level. We cannot afford not to do it, because this is the way that we have to build on consumer trust, and also to make sure that all, not only the guests but also the employees are safe in our businesses. And on top of this, we also welcome the WHO guidelines on food and safety and the considerations on accommodation that they have developed, and as well the EU common criteria for health and safety protocols. When it comes to vaccine, well, as David said, we think that this is the solution in the end of the tunnel. Let's hope that member states really carry on by following the Commission recommendations. Let's hope that a lot of people will actually take it, so that community reaches this immunity that is needed in order to try to overcome the situation. Let's hope that effective processes are put in place, and really there is a widespread vaccine availability. Finally, we also think that businesses should play a key role in order to overcome this crisis. And how? So we think that sometimes business plans need to be rethink or rethought, because sometimes conditions change, and even if the entire situation would be put back in the past, sometimes certain behaviors are already there. For instance, as David was mentioning, there will be at least some meetings that will be probably held online instead of physical. So this will probably have an impact in the entire travel community, but it might also create other options and solutions, and therefore the reason why it is important that you think about what are the possibilities that you can offer to the customers. Also, of course, always keep in mind that it's important to have the customer trust in the sector. Then online trainings to upskill and reskill the workforce are essential, especially on digital and green. Think that many people were sent home for an indeterminate period of time. Some of them are at home for a lot of time already. So online trainings are fundamental to keep them motivated, to keep them interested, and for them not to lose their skills even more than what it was the case before. Then to plan activities to become more sustainability friendly and to reduce the carbon footprint is essential. We have targets that the European Commission has committed to, and also the UN, so there's nothing to do about them. We just need to see what constructively and together with all the other stakeholders and public and private sector we can do together. And finally, develop products that are attractive to the consumers. Thank you very much. So I suppose that now I would again pass the floor to Rachel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marta. That was a really comprehensive look at all the aspects of support available for our hospitality industry. Now, we are almost out of time, but I do have a question here for you, Marta, and then perhaps you and David can both move to a quick wrap up before we close the session. Marta, as I say, you gave a very comprehensive look there about the aspects of support for the hospitality sector. What would you say are the next steps for HOTREC then in terms of helping this to be achieved across Europe? What is next on your agenda?
Well, for us, it is really a matter of knowing a little bit more what are the countries asking for, what are they putting on the table, and again, trying together with our members that our messages continue being passed, and that as the more the possible, our ideas are part of these recovery plans. I think this is really the way forward, because this is really a long-term perspective with, as we said, digital environmental priorities that need to be filled in, and only with that we will be able to comply, because otherwise it would be extremely difficult.
Indeed, indeed. So just before we wrap up, here's a question for both of you, I suppose. Perhaps we'll start with David. What do you think is the most positive news for hotels at the moment? Obviously, we're all sitting here feeling a bit sort of in doom and gloom. It's been a really tough year for the industry. So David, so coming to you first, what do you think is a positive that hotels could take at this stage in the situation?
I guess two broad positives. One is the fact that people have not fallen out of love with the idea of taking holidays. So it's not that going on holiday is something people don't want to do. They absolutely do want to do it. And if you go on a holiday, you need a place to lay your head. Hotels are one of the places that often happens. And the other is the fact that, unlike the situation 4 or 5 months ago, we do now know that there are a range of effective vaccines. Now, it is going to take longer than we might hope for a substantial proportion of the population to have been vaccinated, but that is an ongoing process, and that does again give us reasons to say eventually we will get back to a position where people can travel with less paperwork, not having to be worried about can't I do this, that or the other. So it's going to take longer than perhaps we might hope, but hotels can be optimistic that people want to travel and that we now have a realistic roadmap as to what will allow them to do that travelling.
Indeed, there is not only light but also a tunnel, which is great to hear. So coming to you, Marta, what would you say is a positive thing for hotels to think about at the moment?
Well, I think, as David said, the appetite for people to travel is there. I really see, I mean, during the Christmas period, I had the chance to be in Portugal, where for that moment, at least not during the weekend, there were no restrictions to go to bars, restaurants, and so on. And there I really saw, at least in Lisbon, that those restaurants that were open for the locals, they were full. So that is a very good incentive, and I think people should be motivated for that, because if there is appetite, then there will be clients. Now, of course, what is important as well is that there is an harmonization of the restrictions, because we think that the information provided to travelers is fundamental. I mean, no one with a little bit of good sense will actually go and embark on a trip without knowing if they are willing to be able to be back for their respective works, if they need to take a PCR test, how many PCR tests do they need to take when they arrive to their own country. So all this information needs to be secured and really needs to be provided, so that as soon as possible travelers come to the markets and really find the destinations they are looking for. But honestly, I think after all these lockdowns, as long as the conditions are there and as long as it is possible to travel, people are willing and have the appetite to do so. So those are good news for the hotels, I suppose.
Yes, and hopefully more coordinated support for the industry will be a big step forward as well. As I wrap up, just a reminder that we have run this webinar for hoteliers and their clients as part of our Hoteliers European Marketplace programme. So do please go onto our website, etoa.org/HEM, H-E-M, if you would like more information about that B2B matchmaking workshop. It is all online, obviously this year, like the rest of our lives. Do please go and have a look. And it just remains for me to thank very much David Edwards and Marta Machado, and to wish you all a very good morning. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.